The telegram trembled in Josephine Miller's hands as she stood on the train platform in St. Louis, Missouri, watching her three younger siblings huddle together against the autumn wind of 1876. Their faces pale with fear and exhaustion from the journey that had brought them from the orphanage they'd barely escaped. She clutched the worn piece of paper that contained her only hope. A response from Kendrick Raines, a rancher in Muskogee, Indian Territory, who had advertised for a mail-order bride and had agreed to marry her despite the fact that she came with significant baggage in the form of 10-year-old twin brothers, Samuel and Benjamin, and 8-year-old sister, Emma. The man had written back with surprising speed after she'd nervously penned her situation, stating simply that he had room enough for a family and asking if she could be in Muskogee by November. It was now the first week of November, and Josephine was 21 years old with the weight of 4 lives resting squarely on her shoulders. "Josie, I'm scared," Emma whispered, tugging at her older sister's threadbare coat. The little girl's dark curls were tangled from the long journey, and her blue eyes were wide with uncertainty. Josephine knelt down, gathering Emma close while beckoning the boys over. "I know, sweetheart, but we're going to be safe now. Mr. Raines seems like a good man, and he's willing to give us all a home." Samuel, always the more skeptical of the twins, crossed his thin arms. "How do you know he's good? You've never even met him." "Because bad men don't offer to take in 3 children they've never met," Josephine said firmly, though her own heart hammered with doubt. "Now, we need to board this train, and in 2 days, we'll have a real home again." The journey to Indian Territory was long and uncomfortable. The children huddled together on the hard wooden seats while the landscape transformed from the civilized streets of Missouri to the wild, untamed beauty of the frontier. Josephine barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities both wonderful and terrible. What if Kendrick Raines was cruel? What if he'd changed his mind? What if he took one look at the ragged, exhausted group and sent them right back to Missouri? But there was no turning back. The orphanage had made it clear they could no longer house all 4 Miller children together. They'd wanted to separate them, send the boys to one institution and the girls to another. Josephine had used the last of the small inheritance their parents had left to secure train tickets and to pay for this chance at keeping her family together. When the train finally pulled into the station at Muskogee on a crisp November afternoon, Josephine's hands shook as she gathered their few belongings. The town was smaller than she'd expected, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along dusty streets, with the kind of frontier rawness that both frightened and intrigued her. Cowboys and settlers moved about their business, and she could hear the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer ringing against an anvil. "Stay close to me," she instructed the children as they stepped onto the platform. She scanned the crowd nervously, looking for someone who might be Kendrick Raines. In his letters, he described himself as tall with dark hair, but that description could fit half the men in the territory. "Miss Miller." The voice came from behind her, deep and warm with a slight drawl that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Josephine turned to find herself looking up at a man who indeed was tall, probably 6 feet or more, with thick dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn but clean shirt. His eyes were a striking gray-green, set in a sun-weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He was older than her, perhaps by 7 or 8 years, but there was a kindness in his expression that immediately eased some of her fear. "Mr. Raines?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, madam." He removed his hat, revealing more of his handsome features. "And you must be Josephine." His gaze shifted to the 3 children pressed against her skirts, and these would be Samuel, Benjamin, and Emma. The fact that he'd remembered their names from her letter made something warm bloom in Josephine's chest. "Yes, sir. I hope the journey didn't cause any problems with your plans. We came as quickly as we could." Kendrick shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "Not at all. I've been preparing the house for your arrival." He crouched down to be at eye level with the children, his movements slow and unthreatening. "I bet you folks are tired from all that traveling. What do you say we get you home and find you something good to eat?" Emma, always the bravest despite being the youngest, peered at him curiously. "Do you have horses?" "I do indeed," Kendrick said, his smile widening. "Several of them. Do you like horses?" "I've never seen one up close," Emma admitted. "Well, then we'll have to remedy that, won't we?" Kendrick straightened and offered his hand to Josephine. "My wagon is just over here. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch." Josephine placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and the surprising gentleness of his grip. "Thank you for coming to meet us, Mr. Raines. I know this situation is unusual." "Call me Kendrick, please," he said, helping her toward a sturdy wagon hitched to two strong horses. "And there's nothing unusual about family helping family. That's what we're about to become, after all." The ride to the ranch gave Josephine her first real look at the territory that would be her new home. The landscape was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, with rolling hills covered in prairie grass that swayed in the wind like waves on an ocean. Scattered trees dotted the horizon, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing. Kendrick pointed out landmarks as they traveled, his voice patient as he answered the children's endless questions about everything from the wildlife to the local tribes. "The Creek Nation has been here for decades," he explained when Samuel asked about the native people. "Good folks, for the most part. We trade with them sometimes, and they've taught me a lot about living off this land." "Were you scared when you first came here?" Benjamin asked, his earlier reticence giving way to curiosity. Kendrick considered the question seriously. "I was more excited than scared, I think. I came out here about 6 years ago after the war, wanted to make something of my own, away from all the fighting and the bad memories." Josephine caught the shadow that passed over his face at the mention of the war and wondered what he'd seen, what he'd survived. She wanted to ask but held her tongue. They were still strangers, after all, regardless of the legal papers that would soon bind them together. The ranch, when it finally came into view, took Josephine's breath away. It wasn't grand or fancy, but it was solid and real in a way that made her heart ache with hope. The main house was a well-built wooden structure with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. There was a barn nearby, a chicken coop, and several other outbuildings she couldn't identify. Horses moved in a fenced pasture, and she could see cattle in the distance. "It's not much," Kendrick said, seeming almost shy as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "But it's home, and it's paid for free and clear." "It's wonderful," Josephine breathed, and she meant it. After months of uncertainty and fear, the sight of this solid, permanent place made tears prick at her eyes. Kendrick helped them all down from the wagon, then led them into the house. The interior was simple but clean, with sturdy furniture and a large stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the main room. He showed them through the space with obvious pride, pointing out the kitchen with its cast iron stove, the main bedroom, and then a smaller room with 2 beds. "I fixed this up for the children," he said, gesturing to the room. "The boys can share one bed and Emma can have the other. I hope that's all right." "It's more than all right," Josephine said softly. "It's more than we could have hoped for." Kendrick nodded, then cleared his throat. "As for us, I'll take the loft for now. There's a space up there I've been using for storage, but I cleaned it out and made it suitable for sleeping. I figure we can take things slow, get to know each other before we make any permanent arrangements." The thoughtfulness of this gesture made Josephine's eyes sting with grateful tears. She'd been terrified that he would expect immediate intimacy, that she'd be forced into a stranger's bed before she'd even learned his last name properly. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's very kind." Over the next few days, Josephine and the children settled into a routine that felt both strange and wonderfully normal. Kendrick proved to be a patient and gentle man, never pushing for more than Josephine was ready to give. He showed the boys how to care for the horses and taught them to gather eggs from the chickens. Emma followed him everywhere, chattering constantly about everything she saw and thought, and Kendrick listened to every word with genuine interest. Josephine threw herself into caring for the house, cooking meals that were far better than anything Kendrick had been making for himself, and organizing the space with a woman's touch that had been sorely lacking. She mended his clothes, cleaned every surface until it gleamed, and tried to prove that she was worth the risk he'd taken on them. On the fourth evening after their arrival, as the children slept soundly in their room, exhausted from a day of exploring the ranch, Kendrick and Josephine sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie in a blaze of orange and pink. "You don't have to work so hard, you know," Kendrick said quietly. "You're not a servant here. You're meant to be my wife." Josephine folded her hands in her lap, studying them in the fading light. "I just want to make sure you don't regret taking us in. 4 extra mouths to feed is no small thing." "I don't regret it," Kendrick said firmly. He was silent for a moment, then continued, "Can I tell you something?" "Of course. When I came out here after the war, I was running from things. Bad memories, mostly. I saw things during the fighting that changed me, made me hard inside." He paused, his hands gripping the porch railing. "I built this ranch thinking that working the land would be enough, that I could live out here alone and be content. But the truth is, I've been lonely. The kind of lonely that settles into your bones and makes you forget what it feels like to be part of something bigger than yourself." Josephine listened, her heart aching for the pain in his voice. "When I sent out that advertisement for a bride, I'll admit, I was looking for convenience more than anything else. Someone to cook and clean and maybe give me sons to help with the ranch someday." He turned to look at her, his gray-green eyes intense in the twilight. "But when I got your letter, when you told me about your siblings and how you refused to let them be separated, something in me woke up. I thought about how lucky those children were to have someone who loved them that much, and I thought about how I wanted to be part of that kind of love." "Kendrick," Josephine whispered, not trusting herself to say more. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he said quickly. "I just want you to know that you and those children, you're not a burden. You're a gift. You've brought life back into this place and into me." Josephine felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I was so scared," she admitted. "When our parents died last year from the fever, I didn't know how I was going to keep us together. The orphanage was horrible. They wanted to split us up, and I couldn't let that happen. Samuel and Benjamin and Emma, they're all I have left in this world." "Not anymore," Kendrick said gently. "Now you have me too. And I promise you, Josephine, I will spend every day making sure you and those children are safe and cared for." She looked up at him through her tears and saw the sincerity in his face, the honest goodness that radiated from him. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, and he took it carefully as if she were something precious. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." They sat together as the stars began to emerge, hand in hand, and Josephine felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. The following week brought new challenges and small joys. Kendrick took Josephine into town to meet the minister and to officially record their marriage. The ceremony was simple, conducted in the small wooden church with only the minister's wife and the children as witnesses. When Kendrick slipped a simple gold band onto Josephine's finger, she felt the significance of the moment settle over her like a warm blanket. "I promise to honor and protect you," Kendrick said, his voice low and serious, "for as long as I live." "And I promise to stand beside you," Josephine responded, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "through whatever comes." The minister pronounced them husband and wife, but Kendrick didn't kiss her, respecting the boundaries they'd established. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently and smiled, and that was enough for now. Life on the ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm. The children thrived in the open air and freedom. Samuel and Benjamin grew stronger from the outdoor work, their thin frames filling out with proper food and exercise. Emma's laughter rang through the house daily, and her attachment to Kendrick grew deeper with each passing day. One afternoon in late November, Josephine was kneading bread dough when she heard shouts from outside. Her heart leaped into her throat as she rushed to the window, terrified that something had happened to one of the children. Instead, she saw Kendrick in the corral with Samuel and Benjamin, teaching them to ride a gentle mare. Emma sat on the fence cheering them on. Josephine wiped her hands on her apron and went outside, watching as Kendrick patiently guided Samuel around the corral, his voice calm and encouraging. When the boy completed a full circuit without help, Kendrick's proud grin was genuine and warm. "You're a natural," he told Samuel. "Both of you boys are. By spring, you'll be riding well enough to help me move the cattle." "Really?" Benjamin asked, his eyes shining with excitement. "Really," Kendrick confirmed. He caught sight of Josephine and waved her over. "Your sister should learn too. Everyone on a ranch needs to know how to handle a horse." "I've never ridden," Josephine protested, but Kendrick was already helping the boys down and leading the mare toward her. "No better time to learn than now," he said, his eyes twinkling with amusement at her obvious nervousness. With Kendrick's patient instruction and the children's enthusiastic encouragement, Josephine found herself atop the horse, gripping the reins with white-knuckled fear. But Kendrick walked beside her, one hand on the mare's bridle and the other ready to steady her if needed, and slowly her fear gave way to exhilaration. "You're doing wonderfully," Kendrick said, looking up at her with such warmth in his eyes that Josephine felt her breath catch. In that moment, sitting atop the horse with the prairie wind in her hair and this good man smiling at her, Josephine realized that her feelings for Kendrick had shifted from gratitude to something deeper, something that made her heart race whenever he was near. That evening, after the children were asleep, Josephine found Kendrick in the barn checking on the horses. She'd brought him coffee, using it as an excuse to seek him out. "Thought you might want something warm," she said, offering him the cup. "Thank you kindly," he said, accepting it with a smile. "You settling in all right? I know it's a big change from city life." "It's the best change I could have imagined," Josephine said honestly. She gathered her courage and continued, "Kendrick, I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for us. The way you treat the children, the patience you've shown me. You're a good man." Kendrick set down his coffee cup and moved closer to her. "Josephine, I need to be honest with you. When you first arrived, I thought I was doing a charitable thing, taking in a woman and her siblings who needed help. But these past few weeks, I've realized something." "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "The way you care for those children, the strength you have despite everything you've been through, the sound of your laughter when Emma tells one of her silly stories. I find myself looking for excuses to be near you, and when I'm working out in the fields, I can't wait to get back to the house because I know you'll be there." Josephine's heart soared. "I've been feeling the same way," she admitted. "I was afraid to say anything because this started as a business arrangement, but Kendrick, You've shown me what a good man truly is. You've given my siblings a home and hope for the future. You've treated me with respect and kindness. How could I not fall in love with you?" Kendrick reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. "May I kiss you, please?" she whispered. His lips met hers in a kiss that was tender and full of promise. It wasn't demanding or rushed, but rather a gentle exploration that left Josephine feeling cherished and desired. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Kendrick rested his forehead against hers. "I want you to move into the main bedroom with me," he said quietly. "As my true wife in every way, but only if you're ready. I won't rush you." "I'm ready," Josephine said, surprised by her own certainty. "I trust you, Kendrick. I love you." "I love you too," he said, kissing her again, deeper this time. That night, Josephine moved her few belongings into the main bedroom, and for the first time since arriving in Indian Territory, she truly felt like she'd come home. Kendrick was gentle and patient with her, mindful of her inexperience, and their union felt like the natural completion of the bond that had been growing between them since the moment they'd met. As winter settled over the territory, the Raines family grew closer. Kendrick officially adopted the 3 children in a simple ceremony at the courthouse, giving them his name and making them legally his own. Samuel, Benjamin, and Emma were overjoyed, having found in Kendrick the father figure they'd lost when their own father had died. Christmas came, and though money was tight, they celebrated with a feast and small gifts that Kendrick and Josephine had secretly prepared. Kendrick had carved wooden horses for the boys and a doll for Emma, while Josephine had knitted scarves and mittens for everyone. The children gave their parents drawings they'd made, depicting the ranch and their new family, and the simple gifts were treasured more than any store-bought items could have been. On Christmas night, as snow fell gently outside and the children slept peacefully in their room, Kendrick and Josephine lay together in their bed, warm beneath heavy quilts. "This is the best Christmas I've ever had," Kendrick said, pulling Josephine close against his side. "Mine too," she agreed, resting her head on his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "A year ago I thought we'd lost everything. Now I have more than I ever dreamed possible. We're going to have a good life here," Kendrick promised. "I'll work hard to make sure you and the children have everything you need." "We already have everything we need," Josephine said softly. "We have each other." Winter passed slowly but comfortably. The family spent long evenings gathered around the fireplace, with Kendrick teaching the boys to whittle and Josephine helping Emma learn to read from the few books they owned. On particularly cold nights, they would all sit together while Kendrick told stories of his adventures before the war, or Josephine shared memories of her parents that kept them alive in the children's hearts. Spring arrived with a burst of new life. The prairie bloomed with wildflowers, calves were born, and the ranch hummed with activity. Samuel and Benjamin had grown tall and strong over the winter, and they worked alongside Kendrick with increasing skill and confidence. Emma helped Josephine in the garden they'd planted, learning to tend the vegetables that would feed them through the coming year. One warm April evening, Josephine was preparing supper when a wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the counter, breathing deeply until it passed. It wasn't the first time she'd felt strange lately. Her body seemed different somehow, more sensitive and prone to unexpected bouts of fatigue and nausea. When Kendrick came in from the fields, dirty and tired, but wearing the contented expression he always had these days, Josephine made a decision. "Can we talk after supper?" she asked quietly. Concern immediately crossed his face. "Is something wrong?" "No," she said quickly. "At least I don't think so. I just need to discuss something with you." They ate with the children, listening to Emma's excited chatter about the baby chicks that had hatched that morning, and the boys' plans for building a tree house in the big oak by the creek. After the meal, the children went outside to play in the last light of evening, and Kendrick and Josephine sat together at the table. "What's troubling you?" Kendrick asked, taking her hand. "I'm not troubled exactly," Josephine said, searching for the right words. "I think I might be with child." Kendrick's eyes widened and a slow smile spread across his face. "Truly, I'm not certain yet, but all the signs point to it. I've been feeling strange for a few weeks now, and I'm late with my monthly courses." Kendrick pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "That's wonderful news." "How do you feel about it?" "Scared," Josephine admitted, "and happy, and worried about how the children will react. They've had us to themselves for these months, and I don't want them to feel pushed aside." "They won't," Kendrick assured her. "They're good kids with big hearts. They'll love having a baby brother or sister." He was right. When they told the children the next morning, the response was overwhelming enthusiasm. Emma was particularly excited at the prospect of not being the youngest anymore, and the boys immediately began planning ways to help with the baby. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months. Josephine's belly grew round, and Kendrick was attentive and protective, always making sure she didn't overwork herself. The children adapted well to the coming change, with Emma frequently talking to Josephine's stomach, and the boys building a cradle under Kendrick's supervision. It was during this time that trouble came to the territory in the form of cattle rustlers. Several nearby ranches reported missing livestock, and tension ran high among the settlers. Kendrick increased his vigilance, often spending nights in the barn to guard their herd. One hot August night, Josephine woke to the sound of gunshots. Her heart pounding, she heaved herself out of bed, her pregnant belly making movement awkward, and rushed to check on the children. They were awake and frightened, huddled together in their room. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice firm despite her fear. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." She made her way to the window and saw figures moving in the darkness near the cattle pasture. More shots rang out, and she saw the flash of gunfire. Terror gripped her, not for herself but for Kendrick out there in the darkness facing unknown danger. The confrontation seemed to last forever but was probably only minutes. Finally, she saw men riding away fast, and then silence fell. Josephine waited, her heart in her throat, until she finally saw Kendrick walking back toward the house, leading his horse. She rushed outside, moving as quickly as her condition allowed. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," he assured her, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Scared off 4 men trying to make off with some of our cattle. Didn't hit anyone, just fired enough shots to make them think twice about sticking around." "You could have been killed," Josephine said, and to her embarrassment she began to cry. Kendrick pulled her gently into his arms. "Hey now, I'm all right, I know how to handle myself. I wasn't about to let anyone take what we've worked so hard to build." The children appeared in the doorway, having disobeyed Josephine's order to stay put, and Kendrick reassured them as well. The family spent the rest of the night together in the main room, no one wanting to be alone after the scare. In the morning, Kendrick rode to the neighboring ranches and to town to report the incident. A group of ranchers decided to organize regular patrols, taking turns watching over each other's property. The system worked, and within a few weeks, several of the rustlers were caught and brought to justice. Life settled back into its peaceful rhythm, and Josephine's time grew near. In late September, on a cool morning when the leaves were just beginning to turn, she woke Kendrick with the news that the baby was coming. Kendrick immediately rode for the doctor in town and for their nearest neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who had experience with birthing. While they waited, Emma stayed close to Josephine, holding her hand and trying to be helpful despite her obvious fear. The boys occupied themselves outside, anxiously checking the road for the doctor's arrival. The labor was long and difficult. Josephine had expected pain, but the reality was far beyond anything she'd imagined. Mrs. Henderson was kind but firm, guiding her through each contraction with experienced efficiency. Kendrick stayed by her side when the doctor arrived, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even as she squeezed his fingers hard enough to hurt. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Josephine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The doctor placed the squalling infant on her chest, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face with overwhelming love. "He's beautiful," Kendrick said, his voice thick with emotion. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he gazed at his son. "What should we name him?" Josephine asked, exhausted but happier than she'd ever been. "I was thinking about my father's name," Kendrick said. "Thomas, if that's all right with you." "Thomas Raines," Josephine said, testing out the name. "It's perfect." The children were allowed in to meet their new brother, and their reactions were priceless. Emma was immediately smitten, begging to hold him. Samuel and Benjamin were more hesitant but clearly awed by the tiny person who was now part of their family. "He's so small," Benjamin whispered. "Were we ever that small?" "You were," Josephine confirmed, smiling at the memory. "And I took care of you just like we'll all take care of Thomas." The weeks after Thomas's birth were a blur of feedings and diaper changes and sleepless nights. Kendrick proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with the baby when he cried at night so Josephine could rest. The older children helped as much as they could, with Emma particularly insistent on being involved in every aspect of the baby's care. As winter approached again, the ranch continued to thrive. Kendrick's hard work and skill with cattle had earned him a solid reputation in the territory, and he'd been able to purchase additional land, expanding their holdings. The children were all enrolled in the new school that had opened in Muskogee, making the journey to town several times a week for their lessons. One evening in December, as the family gathered around the dinner table with baby Thomas sleeping in his cradle nearby, Samuel cleared his throat nervously. "Father," he said, and Josephine's heart warmed at hearing him use that title for Kendrick. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for us." "You don't need to thank me," Kendrick said, surprised. "You're my family." "But you didn't have to take us in," Benjamin added. "You could have just married Josie and sent us away. But you made us your own, and you've been better to us than we had any right to expect." Emma nodded vigorously. "You're the best father in the whole world." Kendrick looked around the table at his family, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You children are one of the greatest blessings of my life. Along with your sister and our little Thomas, you've given me more than I ever hoped to have. I'm the one who should be thankful." Josephine reached across the table to take his hand, loving him more in that moment than she'd thought possible. The years passed with surprising speed. Thomas grew from a baby into a rambunctious toddler who followed his older siblings everywhere they went. The twins became strong young men, skilled at ranching and invaluable to Kendrick in running the ever-expanding operation. Emma grew into a beautiful young lady with her mother's kind heart and her father's determination. When Thomas was 3 years old, Josephine found herself pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy felt easier despite the fact that she was older now. Kendrick was just as attentive as he'd been the first time, maybe even more so, constantly worrying about her health and comfort. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret, arrived in the spring of 1881, completing their family. She was a sweet-tempered baby with Josephine's dark curls and Kendrick's gray-green eyes, and she was absolutely adored by everyone in the household. Life on the ranch was good. Kendrick had built something substantial from his initial homestead, and the Raines name was respected throughout the territory. Samuel and Benjamin, now strapping young men of 18, worked the ranch alongside their father, and there was talk of eventually dividing the land so each of the boys could have their own section to develop. Emma, at 16, had attracted the attention of several young men in town, but she'd shown no serious interest in any of them yet, much to Josephine's relief. She wasn't ready to lose her sister-daughter to marriage just yet. One warm summer evening, the family gathered on the expanded porch that Kendrick had built to accommodate their growing numbers. Thomas, now 6 years old, was playing with wooden horses while baby Margaret slept in Josephine's arms. The twins were discussing plans for a new barn, and Emma was reading aloud from a book of poetry. Kendrick sat beside Josephine, his arm around her shoulders, and looked out over the land he'd built into a thriving ranch. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The sun was setting in a spectacular display of color, and his family was healthy and happy around him. "What are you thinking about?" Josephine asked softly, noticing his contemplative expression. "Just about how different my life could have been," he said. "If I hadn't sent out that advertisement, if you hadn't written back, if I'd been too scared to take a chance on a woman with 3 children who needed a home." "I think about that too sometimes," Josephine admitted. "About how desperate I was, how frightened. I was taking such a huge risk coming out here to marry a stranger." "Best risk either of us ever took," Kendrick said, kissing her temple gently. "The very best," she agreed. Samuel looked up from his discussion with Benjamin and smiled at his parents. "You two are disgustingly romantic, you know that. Just you wait," Kendrick said with a laugh. "Someday you'll meet a woman who turns your world upside down, and then you'll understand." "I hope I find someone half as wonderful as Josie," Samuel said sincerely. "You set the bar pretty high, Mother." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes at the love in his voice. These children, who had started as her responsibility and burden, had become such remarkable people. And the man beside her, who had taken them all in sight unseen, had proven to be everything she'd never dared to hope for in a husband. The years continued to pass in a pattern of seasons and celebrations. The twins eventually married, Samuel to a sweet-natured girl from town named Catherine, and Benjamin to a rancher's daughter named Mary. Both couples built homes on sections of the Raines land, staying close to the family while starting their own lives. Emma, who had worried her parents by showing no interest in marriage for years, finally fell in love with a schoolteacher who moved to Muskogee when she was 21. Jonathan was a kind, educated man who appreciated Emma's intelligence and spirit, and Kendrick gave his blessing for the marriage with only a few stern warnings about treating his daughter right. Thomas grew tall and strong, showing signs of becoming an even better rancher than his father. He had Kendrick's natural way with animals and Josephine's head for figures, keeping meticulous records of the ranch's operations even as a young teenager. Margaret, sweet and gentle, was the darling of the family. She loved helping her mother in the garden and had a particular talent for healing, often tending to injured animals with remarkable success. On Josephine and Kendrick's 20th wedding anniversary, the family gathered for a celebration that filled the ranch house to bursting. All of their children were there, along with grandchildren who had arrived over the years. Samuel and Catherine had 3 children, Benjamin and Mary had 4, and Emma and Jonathan had just welcomed their first baby. As Josephine looked around the crowded, noisy, wonderful gathering, she could barely believe this was her life. From the terrified young woman who had stepped off the train in Muskogee with 3 orphaned siblings, she had become the matriarch of a large and loving family. "Happy anniversary, my love," Kendrick said, finding her in the kitchen where she'd gone to compose herself. At 50, he was still handsome, his dark hair now streaked with silver but his eyes just as bright and loving as they'd been on the day they met. "Happy anniversary," she responded, going into his arms as naturally as breathing. "Can you believe it's been 20 years? Best 20 years of my life," he said firmly, "though I have to say I'm looking forward to the next 20 even more." "Oh," Josephine asked, amused, "and why is that?" "Because now we get to watch our grandchildren grow up," he said. "And because I get to spend them with you, and every year I love you more than the last, so imagine how much I'll love you 20 years from now." "You silver-tongued devil," Josephine said, laughing even as tears streamed down her face. "You still know exactly what to say." "I only speak the truth," Kendrick said, kissing her soundly. They were interrupted by Thomas, now a young man of 17, poking his head into the kitchen. "Sorry to interrupt, but Grandma wants to make a toast." The family gathered in the main room, glasses of cider and wine raised. Kendrick's mother, who had traveled from Kansas for the occasion, stood with surprising steadiness for her advanced age. "I want to say how proud I am of my son," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "When he came back from the war, I didn't think he'd ever find peace. He was so damaged, so closed off. But then he came out here to this wild territory and built something remarkable. And when he found Josephine and those precious children, he became the man I always knew he could be." She turned to Josephine directly. "Thank you, dear girl, for loving my son and giving him the family he needed. You've been a blessing to all of us." There wasn't a dry eye in the house as they toasted and drank. The evening continued with music and dancing, stories and laughter. The grandchildren played together while the adults reminisced about years past and made plans for years to come. Late that night, after all the guests had gone to bed in various corners of the house and outbuildings, Kendrick and Josephine finally found themselves alone in their bedroom. They prepared for bed in comfortable silence, the kind that came from years of partnership and deep love. As they lay together in the darkness, Josephine thought about the journey that had brought them here. The fear and desperation that had driven her to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride felt like someone else's story now. She couldn't imagine her life without Kendrick, without this ranch, without the family they'd built together. "What are you thinking about?" Kendrick asked, sensing her wakefulness. "Everything," she said simply. "How scared I was on that train platform. How you looked when I first saw you, so kind and steady. The way you immediately loved the children. All the years we've had together, all the challenges we've faced and overcome." "We've had a good life," Kendrick agreed. "The very best life," Josephine corrected. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "It's not over yet," Kendrick reminded her. "We've got a lot more years ahead of us, God willing." "I know," Josephine said, snuggling closer to his warmth, "and I plan to treasure every single one of them." The years did continue blessed and full. Kendrick and Josephine watched their family grow and flourish. The ranch prospered under the management of Kendrick and his sons, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. When Oklahoma achieved statehood in 1907, the Raines family was well established and respected in the community. Thomas married a lovely young woman named Sarah and took over the day-to-day management of the main ranch house, allowing Kendrick to finally slow down a bit. Margaret, who had studied nursing, returned to Muskogee after her training and became an invaluable resource to the growing town, often riding out to help families in need. Kendrick and Josephine moved into a smaller house on the property, built specifically for them by their sons. It was cozy and comfortable, with a porch that overlooked the prairie they both loved. They spent their days tending a small garden, receiving visits from their ever-growing number of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and simply enjoying each other's company. On a warm spring evening in 1912, Kendrick and Josephine sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. They were both in their late 60s now, their bodies worn by years of hard work but their spirits still strong. "Do you remember the first time we sat together and watched the sunset?" Josephine asked, taking Kendrick's weathered hand in hers. "Of course I do," Kendrick replied. "It was just a few days after you arrived. I told you I was falling in love with you." "And I was terrified and thrilled all at the same time," Josephine said with a soft laugh. "I couldn't believe this good, kind man could actually care for me and my siblings." "Best decision I ever made," Kendrick said, his voice rough with emotion even after all these years. "Taking a chance on a letter from a desperate young woman, welcoming 3 scared children into my home and my heart, marrying you. We've had such a beautiful life together," Josephine said, tears streaming down her lined face. "You gave me and the children everything. A home, security, love, family. You turned what could have been a transaction into a true partnership and romance." "You gave me just as much," Kendrick insisted. "You brought light and laughter back into my life. You gave me children to love and raise. You built a home that was warm and welcoming. You loved me even when I didn't think I deserved to be loved." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Around them they could hear the sounds of their family, children playing, someone strumming a guitar, laughter floating on the evening breeze. "Josephine," Kendrick said quietly. "Thank you." "For what?" she asked. "For taking a chance on me, for trusting me with your siblings, for building this life with me, for loving me all these years." "Thank you for being the man worthy of that trust," Josephine replied. "For being the father those children needed. For being the husband I never dared to dream of. For every day of these past 36 years." As darkness settled fully over the prairie and the stars blazed brilliantly overhead, Kendrick and Josephine remained on their porch, 2 people who had started as strangers brought together by circumstance and had become partners, lovers, best friends, and the foundation of a family legacy that would continue for generations. Their story, which had begun with a desperate letter and a lonely cowboy's advertisement, had become something far greater than either of them could have imagined. It was a testament to the power of love, trust, and the courage to take chances on hope even when the odds seemed impossible. And as they finally rose to go inside for the night, Kendrick helped Josephine to her feet with the same gentleness he'd shown that first day at the train station. And Josephine looked at him with the same love and gratitude that had grown deeper with every passing year. Their love story, born in the wild west of Indian Territory, had not just survived but flourished, creating ripples that would touch countless lives in the years to come. And somewhere in heaven, if such things could be known, the parents who had left their children too soon surely smiled, knowing that their daughter's courage and their children's lives had led to something beautiful and lasting. The Raines family legacy lived on through the generations, each new child growing up hearing stories of the mail-order bride who brought her orphaned siblings west and the cowboy who welcomed them all as his own, proving that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that begin with faith, hope, and the willingness to open your heart to those in need.